As we produce this documentary in mid-2021, several important questions are being tossed around like a political football. What should be a human issue has become a hot political issue, and even a legal issue. Let's look at some of the most common questions. First question, how many people are experiencing homelessness in the shelters and on the streets of our community? Let's begin by setting a couple of benchmarks when it comes to homelessness and shelter beds. Every community receiving federal dollars to combat homelessness is required by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, otherwise known as HUD, to conduct an annual census of their homeless population. It's called the point-in-time count, and it's conducted every year during the last 10 days of January. According to Spokane's 2020 point-in-time count, the last full count before COVID, 1,559 individuals were experiencing homelessness in the shelters and on the streets of our city during the last week of January that year. At this point, you may be thinking that we're exaggerating the number of people experiencing homelessness in Spokane. Actually, our numbers are very conservative. As we were producing this documentary, I received a copy of a report titled Snapshot of Homelessness in Washington State for July 2020, produced by the Washington State Department of Commerce. According to Table 4 of that report, 5,424 individuals were experiencing homelessness in Spokane County in July of 2020, 6 months after the point-in-time count. The report hasn't been updated due to staffing issues, but my guess would be that the numbers from that report are larger today than they were in 2020. Welcome to the river of homelessness that flows through our community. It's deeper and wider than you think. Second question, do we have enough shelter beds for the known and counted homeless population? The short answer is no, we don't. The City of Spokane keeps a shelter capacity tracking report compiled and maintained by the city's Community Housing and Human Services Department. Here it is. According to that capacity report, Spokane's citywide shelter system had a capacity of 805 beds in January of 2020, when the point-in-time count recorded 1,559 people experiencing homelessness. That's a shortfall of 754 beds. That's enough beds for only 52% of the known and counted homeless population. Think of it this way. If every person experiencing homelessness in January of 2020 had shown up at local shelters looking for a bed, 48 out of 100 would have been turned away because there were no beds. Third question, what's the shelter bed capacity today in 2021? A June 13, 2021 article in the Spokesman Review stated that preliminary data from the January 2021 point-in-time count showed that 992 people were counted in city shelters that month. The City of Spokane used this preliminary data to argue that the citywide shelter capacity was 992 beds. No, it isn't. The annual point-in-time count is always divided into two parts, sheltered and unsheltered. Due to COVID restrictions, the 2021 count did not include the unsheltered part. People not staying in shelters simply were not counted. The remaining sheltered portion of the count is always divided between emergency shelter beds and transitional housing. Historically, the emergency shelter portion of the sheltered count is consistently about 79% of the total, with the transitional housing portion making up the other 21%. For 2021, this would mean 783 shelter beds were filled, not 992. And the city's own capacity report showed 773 total shelter beds in the citywide system at that time. According to the city's own internal numbers, the shelters were full. Do you see the problem? If the shelters were full in January of 2021, where were the unsheltered homeless that did not get counted supposed to go? Because there were no beds. Using the unsheltered numbers from the 2020 count, this would mean 541 unsheltered individuals with no access to a shelter, a bed, or the services those shelters might provide. Getting an accurate count of emergency shelter beds often feels like trying to nail Jell-O to a tree, due in no small part to the city's lack of transparency. As part of this documentary project, our research team directly contacted every shelter in our city and asked them to verify their bed capacity and how many of those beds were low barrier beds. This graphic shows the result of our research. The citywide shelter system has never had more than the 805 emergency shelter beds reported in January of 2020. As this graphic shows, by mid-2021, as we filmed this documentary, that number had fallen to 769, for a net loss of 36 beds. For a city with a known and counted homeless population of 1,559, having only 769 shelter beds presents a problem. The homeless have nowhere to go. Fourth question, are there open shelter beds every night, and why don't the homeless access those beds? A new catchphrase recently entered the discussion surrounding those who refuse to stay in local shelters. They're referred to as shelter resistant. Let me be clear, shelter resistance is a myth. These are people who, like my friend Jeremy, simply cannot maintain in a traditional shelter. And the reasons run much deeper than a catchphrase, much deeper issues than the number of available beds. The reality is that we don't have the right kinds of shelter beds.
And I do want to push back against this myth, urban legend out there that the people who are not in shelters don't want to be sheltered. That is just completely untrue, and the numbers don't bear that out. The shelters that we had last year, we had 2 shelters that were low barrier, 24/7 co-ed shelters. They were full every night. They were totally full, and when we closed one of those shelters this summer, which we shouldn't have done, but when we did, the city did it, those people went back to living on the streets. We knew they liked shelters. There are some people that might not want to go to a particular shelter if the rules are too harsh, or might be a particular religion, or it's really a drug treatment center and they're not either appropriate for drug treatment or they're not ready. There are occasions like that, but for the most part, people who are living in the cold and the heat, if you gave them low barrier shelter that worked for their psychological and mental health needs, they would take us up on it, and they do regularly.
I sat down with Dr. Samuel Murray to explore his thoughts on issues of trauma and shelter resistance.
One of the symptom clusters is avoidance. You know, that's in the definition of the illness, that a person would avoid stimuli that would recreate the emotions or the physical sensations of the original trauma, or the stacked traumas on top of each other. And so, you know, if I think about people who grew up in poverty, in homes where there was people coming and going all the time, where there might have been someone selling or using drugs out of the home, where there was unpredictable violence, where a lot of noise coming out of the parents' bedroom meant there was a fight, right? And you go to a shelter environment where a lot of that's, you know, shelters can be quiet places, shelters can be calm places. There's lots of really, really good shelters. But even in the best of circumstances, shelters are dynamic places. There's a lot going on. And that amount of stimuli for a person who has that past experience, to me, it makes sense that it would be avoided. It might be for a person, an individual person, it might feel safer to go sleep unsheltered on a park bench and be at risk of frostbite than to go into a situation where they know they're going to be on edge, they're going to be hypervigilant, they're going to be waiting for something bad to happen, they're not going to get any rest, and they're likely to feel worse.
For the street homeless, the issues keeping them out of shelters involve such things as deep personal trauma, including trauma experienced in shelters, mental health, like Jeremy, medical respite issues, substance abuse, concerns about personal safety, especially among homeless women. I've personally spoken with women who have recounted their experiences of being sexually exploited by shelter staff. There's more, but hopefully we get the point. By the way, these are some of the same issues which prevent the homeless and marginalized from accessing city-sponsored cooling and warming centers. The popular myth of shelter resistance exposes the glaring lack of the right kinds of shelter beds. But there's more.
I have a background in clinical psychology, education, and training. And one of the things I learned really early on from one of my mentors was this rule that everyone's behavior makes sense once you get all the information. Even things that seem inexplicable to us on the surface can be explained once you know everything that's factoring into that behavior. It could be something as dramatic as they live in a different reality because they have delusions or hallucinations. Schizophrenia, for instance. You might see someone running down the street yelling in terror with nothing behind them, which makes no sense to you, but when you learn more about that person, they may actually see a bear chasing them, and so it actually makes perfect sense for them. And when you understand that someone has trauma in their history, or an addiction, or mental illness, or poverty, or any number of factors that make sense to them when you get to know it, then you can start solving the problem.
So, are you a vet?
Absolutely.
Have you gotten
I
any?
was killed at sea, actually. I died in the Navy, and they brought me back to life.
Have you gotten any? What you're seeing in this video is a homeless veteran with severe PTSD and mental health issues, whom I filmed and interviewed with his permission under a bridge one winter's evening in January of 2021. A police sweep may move him out from under the bridge, as it did the following week. But there are no shelter beds for him that will meet his mental health needs. 100 empty shelter beds in a dozen traditional shelters won't address his challenges. Where is he supposed to go? And there are many more like him in the subterranean river of homelessness that flows through our city. Where are they supposed to go when traditional barrier shelters simply won't work? One of the answers to this question is the availability of low barrier shelters where the shelter resistant can rebuild lost trust, find safety, stability, and a path forward. And that brings us to our next question. What is a low barrier shelter, and why does it matter? And do they even work? Recently, federal courts have increasingly ruled in favor of the homeless based on the lack of adequate shelter beds, preventing cities from enforcing municipal no camping or sit-and-lie ordinances when there are insufficient low-barrier beds to accommodate the unsheltered homeless.
I think the Martin versus Boise decision illustrates really well the limited power of the courts and what their power actually is. It was considered a major blow for homelessness rights and people who advocate for the homeless to get finally a court victory that said there's a limit on what the city can do. But it's important to remember a few things. It was rare. It got so much attention because it's not often that plaintiffs win cases like that. It was vigorously opposed. There were a number of dissents that were some of the most strongly worded dissents I've ever read in my career as a lawyer, to saying how wrong the court was to do this. And so judges aren't of one mind to do what was done in Martin v. Boise. And then it was very limited in scope within itself. It held only that it violates the 8th Amendment for the police to arrest somebody for being on the streets if there are no homeless shelter beds available. But of course that leaves a lot of other options available to the police. So when there are homeless beds available, they can still arrest people. And it only says that you can't criminalize the existence of somebody as a poor person or homeless or unhoused person. But it left open the option of police to still arrest people for conduct crimes, such as obstructing the sidewalk or other things that aren't based on their existence. And so police have been able to get around a lot of the Martin versus Boise spirit by doing that. The power of Martin v. Boise was not in what the court ordered, it's how the public responded to the court's decision. The media gave it a lot of attention, and then people gave it a lot of attention as community members, speaking up at city council meetings and writing into their politicians and marching and demanding that, hey, this is a problem if we're arresting people. And the decision itself made Boise change during the litigation. It changes policies to say we're not going to enforce the sit-and-lie law while shelters are full, and it admitted in the litigation that arrest should be the last resort, and it's prompted Boise and other cities around the country to start thinking about investing more in shelters and housing and low barriers to getting the housing.
The city of Spokane has publicly acknowledged that it doesn't have the low barrier day shelter space required by the courts to enforce its own no camping or sit and lie ordinances. So yes, low barrier shelters matter when it comes to community homeless policy and practice. So let's go back to the whole idea of low barrier shelters versus barriered shelters, and why low barrier shelters are so important for folks like Mr. Green.
Well, how else are you going to get them in off the street? We have high barrier shelters and they're great and they work, but somebody in Mr. Green's condition can't meet those barriers whether he wants to or not. He's not mentally able. His addiction isn't going to get him to maintain long enough, and nobody just quits drugs to go into a shelter. That's just not the way that it works.
On a personal note, I've been directly involved in operating 4 low barrier shelters, 3 of them during a pandemic and under less than ideal conditions. I'm not an expert, but I do play one in documentaries. Low barrier shelters accept anyone regardless of their condition or level of need, and without any requirements for admission or participation. These shelters serve this most vulnerable population as a backstop when everything else has failed. When traditional shelters aren't an option, when everyone else has given up, when the struggling homeless have lost hope and have nowhere else to go to restart their journey back to stability. Low barrier 24/7 shelters can offer not only a safe bed for the night, but a place to spend the day, access services, get food, use a restroom, take a shower, do laundry, securely store their belongings, and even receive medical care when needed. A low barrier shelter can offer stability and a friendly starting point for a new journey out of homelessness, as it did for my friend, Amanda. I met Amanda when she came to stay at the City Church Low Barrier Shelter in late November of 2020. Her stay at the City Church Shelter became the end of a long journey through abuse, trauma, drugs, and homelessness, and the beginning of a new journey into a new life. I asked Amanda to join me back at the City Church Madison building where we met. So let's talk about the fact that we're back in the old shelter at City Church. Looks a lot different from the last time you and I were here, doesn't it?
Completely. Oh yeah. Everything's different. The desks no longer there, the beds, the food, the tables.
Your bed was just about where you're standing right
Yeah.
now, up against the wall there.
Yep.
Let's talk about, where were you before you came here?
I was in a homeless camp in Meade. There was a bunch of us, and it was hard out there. Like, I love the people from there. I could never go back because it's drugs and people living lives that I don't like. Like, they steal just to make money, just to be able to do things, you know? And I couldn't even do it. Like, everyone's like, well, why don't you come with me? I couldn't. Like, I couldn't even go scrap with them because it was still stealing from somebody else, you know? So.
You wound up there, you were fleeing domestic violence.
Yes.
Because you'd been homeless for a while, and you'd been using drugs for a while. How long had that been going on?
The domestic violence was, well, off and on since, well, more on than anything, since 2011 actually. And then the drugs started in 2018, in June of 18.
And then somebody from Jules Helping Hands was doing outreach out there, and that's when you heard about the City Church Shelter, is that right?
Yeah, I was handed 4 sandwiches, some socks, and a bus pass with the address on it, and I was told that the shelter, it was its first day, it was opening day, and if I wanted a bed, they'd save me a bed, and I said yes. And I came that very day. Like, I didn't look back.
You told me once that you'd only been sober or clean for about 4 days when you got here.
Yeah. Yeah, I was clean for 4 days. My clean date is November 27th, officially, because I had done drugs the day before, but no drugs as of November 27th.
How did life here in the shelter impact you? What changed you? You were a very different person than the Amanda I met back in November. What happened?
People caring. I have never experienced anything like I have ever since Jules came into my life. I had people that cared and wanted me to succeed, and they were doing anything and everything they could possible to give me that comfort, that help, that guidance, that everything to be able to keep my life and get off the drugs, get off the streets, and to better my situation.
And other people kind of stepped up too. I know eventually you went to stay with Pastor Jason and his family from City Church right next door here. This is their building. And they basically adopted Amanda and took you into their family.
Yeah, I mean, the night they asked me if I wanted to live with them, I thought I was going over for dinner. Jason goes, well, you want to come over for dinner one night? I said, yeah. So I'm thinking I'm going over to their house just to eat dinner. Well, after we ate dinner, they asked me at the end of it if I wanted to move in because the Spirit was telling them, God was telling them to have me live with them. And so I said yes. I cried like a baby. But now I have my own room because of them. And I have a home. I have a safe place and a family. And I'm involved in the church. And Jason and I keep talking about this building and where I came from and how God saved me in City Church and Jules Helping Hands. Because if it wasn't for everybody involved, I would probably be dead right now.
Something has profoundly changed in Amanda.
Yes, it has. And it's Jules, it's the shelter.
Well, let's talk about that. The importance of a low barrier shelter, which is what this was back in November of 2020 when you came here. How important is it for folks like yourself or others in homeless camps who've not been in shelters for a while to have access to a low barrier shelter? I mean, look what it did for you.
It is beyond important. I always said I would never go to a shelter because of things that have happened growing up and prior at shelters, you know. But having access to a low barrier shelter it's vital. It literally is in our survival of homeless as well as drugs, any drug addict and homeless, because without it, we're afraid to do anything. We're afraid to go to a shelter because who knows what's gonna happen, whether they're gonna call the police and we're gonna get arrested, or if there's gonna be a problem, you know? But having it to where you can come because somebody cares and they don't care about who you are or what you've done, they just care about helping you and continuously helping you. There is nothing more important than that. And that is exactly why I am where I'm at today, because of the people that care and because Jules in the low barrier shelter, because I had the opportunity to come and not be judged, not be ridiculed, nothing, just have a place to lay my head on a bed every single night for 2.5 months. I was fed, I was clothed, I had endless amounts of clothes. I didn't even know what to do with it because people care, because I had access to the low barrier shelter. And I have climbed out of everything because I've had that access and I've had those people. And if it wasn't for the low barrier shelter, I promise you, I would still be on the streets if not dead right now.
One surefire way to not solve a problem is to underestimate its size and to make your plans accordingly. Any plan created on such bad data will be smaller than the problem we're trying to solve and will doom us to eventual program failure. We do ourselves, the homeless, and our larger community no favors by underestimating the size of our homeless population and by offering inadequate one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter shelters that don't address the needs that keep people out of shelters. That's why accurate numbers matter, and why current regional plans to address homelessness are all but guaranteed to fail. The plan continues to be smaller than the problem. Homelessness is much bigger than regional policymakers are willing to acknowledge. Those of us who attempt to speak truth to power often feel like the little boy in Hans Christian Andersen's The Emperor's New Clothes. Not the feedback the Emperor wanted during his unveiling. As for the homeless on the streets and in the parks of our community, they aren't going to mystically disappear. like some urban homeless version of brigadoons, simply because we choose not to accurately count them or provide adequate and appropriate alternatives for them. We'll never build the shalom, the peace and well-being of our community and the homeless who live here by doubling down on the failed approaches of the past. We need a better and a different path forward.